three retirees living in the same town. Each one has a paid-off house and the same Social Security check. The only difference between them is what sits in the retirement account. The first has $300,000. Next door, $600,000. And down the street, $900,000. Everybody assumes the third one gets 3 times what the first gets. That is what the math looks like on paper. It is not what lands in his account. His last $300,000 pays him 21% less every month than the first man's does. Same amount of money, same market, same withdrawal rate. And almost nobody can tell you why. So today we are going to find out what each of those 3 numbers actually pays, after tax in dollars you can spend, and why every $300,000 you add pays less than the one before it. Let me set up the person once. That way we compare the same life 3 times. Our retiree is 67 and single. The house is paid off. Social Security comes in at the national average for a retired worker. In 2026, that is about $2,083 a month. That is $25,000 a year. The retirement money sits in a traditional 401k, so every dollar that comes out is taxed like a paycheck. And we will use the 4% rule. That is the standard planning assumption for a 30-year retirement. Now before we add any portfolio, I want to run the version nobody runs. The control. What does this person get with $0 saved? He gets a Social Security, $25,000 a year, $2,083 a month. And here's the part that surprises people. He pays no federal income tax on it. His provisional income, which is the number the IRS uses to decide how much of your Social Security gets taxed, comes to $12,500. The line is $25,000. He is nowhere near it. So that is the floor. Everyone in this video starts there, at $2,083 a month, tax-free. The portfolio sits on top of it. Now the first man with $300,000. At 4%, he pulls $12,000 a year. That is $1,000 a month. Gross income of $3,083 a month. Now watch what happens to his taxes. His provisional income is the $12,000 withdrawal plus half his Social Security. That comes to $24,500. The threshold is $25,000. He stays under it by $500, so none of his Social Security is taxable. And his $12,000 withdrawal is smaller than his standard deduction. For a single 65-year-old in 2026, that deduction is $24,150. That is the standard amount, plus the age 65 add-on, plus the new senior bonus deduction. His federal tax bill is 0. His first $300,000 pays him exactly $1,000 a month, and he keeps all of it. That brick is clean. Now the second man, with $600,000, he pulls $24,000 a year. That is $2,000 a month for gross income of $4,083. But his provisional income is now $36,500. He is past the first threshold. He is past the second one too, which sits at $34,000. So a chunk of his Social Security becomes taxable income, specifically $6,625 of it, which is about 26% of his benefit. His taxable income comes to $6,475. He owes $648 in federal tax, so his second $300,000 did not pay him another $1,000 a month. It paid him $946. Now the third man with $900,000. He pulls $36,000 a year. That is $3,000 a month for gross income of $5,083. His provisional income is $48,500. That is $14,500 past the upper threshold. So now $16,825 of his Social Security is taxable. That is 67% of his benefit. It got dragged onto the tax return by withdrawals from a completely different account. His taxable income is $28,675. That produces a federal tax bill of $3,193. His third $300,000 paid him $788 a month. Put the 3 bricks next to each other and the pattern is impossible to miss. The first $300,000 paid $1,000 a month. Number 2 paid $946. And the third paid $788. Same $300,000 3 times. The last one delivered $212 a month less than the first for the rest of his life. Now, the sharpest number in this whole thing, going from $600,000 to $900,000 raised his withdrawal by $12,000. It raised his federal tax by 2,546. That is a 21% bite, and he is sitting in the 12% tax bracket. His bracket says 12. His actual cost is 21. Every dollar he pulls out does two jobs at once. It gets taxed itself, and it drags more of his Social Security onto the taxable line behind it. Planners have a name for this. They call it the tax torpedo. It hits so many people because it is invisible from the outside. Nothing on your tax form says torpedo. You look up your bracket and see 12%, so you assume that is your cost. Then the actual bill arrives and it does not match. Most retirees never find out why. They just conclude the taxes are confusing and move on. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that actually works for normal people, not the kind that gets you to click a thumbnail. No motivational fluff or fantasy returns, we just discuss what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. Now, where did those thresholds come from? This is the part that should make you angry. Two numbers decide how much of your Social Security gets taxed. For a single person, they are $25,000 and $34,000. For a married couple, they are $32,000 and $44,000. Those numbers were written into law in 1984. They have never been adjusted for inflation, not once in 40 years. When Congress set them, they were designed to reach the wealthiest tenth of retirees. In 1984, $25,000 was a comfortable upper-middle-class retirement. Prices have risen more than 3 times over since then. That same threshold now catches an ordinary retired teacher with a modest nest egg. Nobody voted to expand this tax. It expanded on its own, quietly, every year. It did that by standing still while everything else moved. Every cost of living raised Social Security gives you pushes your provisional income higher. The line it is measured against never moves. The raise that was supposed to protect you from inflation is partly what pushes you over, and you can find your own line exactly. For our single retiree with average Social Security, the first taxable dollar shows up once his withdrawal hits $12,500 a year. At a 4% rate, that is a portfolio of about $312,500. The heavier zone starts at a withdrawal of $21,500. That is where up to 85% of the benefit can be pulled in. That is a portfolio of about $537,500. Write those two numbers down if you are single with an average check. They are the two places where your money quietly changes value. So that is the first reason each brick pays less than the last. Taxes escalate while the number stays flat. There is one more thing about that frozen line, and it is the part that compounds against you. Take our man with $600,000. In his first year, 26% of his Social Security is taxable. Now let him age. His Social Security rises with inflation, and his withdrawal rises with it too. So his life stays exactly the same. Same house, same groceries, same everything. 10 years in, 51% of his benefit is taxable. 15 years in, it is 61%. By year 20, 70%. He did not get richer, and he did not spend more. He simply got older, while a 1984 number stayed exactly where it was. The tax on his retirement grew every single year entirely on its own. Here is the second reason, and it has nothing to do with taxes. Look at where the money is actually coming from in each case. With no portfolio, all of this man's income is Social Security. That money is guaranteed by the federal government and adjusted for inflation every year. A market crash does not touch it. At $300,000, Social Security is still 68% of his gross income. Add the second brick and it drops to 51%. At $900,000, it is down to 41%. Read that carefully because it runs backwards. The richer man has more money and less certainty. A bigger share of his life now depends on what the market does. That is not an argument for having less money. More is better, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But it means the third brick is not just taxed harder. It is also a different kind of income than the first one. The first brick sat on a government guarantee. The third one sits on the S&P 500. And there is a third reason, which is the one people feel but never name. The floor does not move. So the first brick does the heaviest lifting in your actual life. Going from $2,083 a month to $3,083 is the difference between counting every grocery trip and not counting them. That first $1,000 buys dignity. It covers the dental work, the car repair, the plane ticket to see the grandkids. Going from 4,083 to 4,817 is a nicer version of a life that already worked, that is real and it is worth having. But it is not the same kind of change. The first brick bought your survival, the third one bought your options. Which leads to something I want you to sit with. Your first $300,000 is the most valuable money you will ever own. It arrives untaxed, it lands on top of a guaranteed floor, and it covers the expenses that actually hurt when you cannot cover them. Nobody makes videos about the first 300,000. It is not an impressive number, it is just the one that does the most work. There is one more wrinkle waiting for the man with 900,000. Right now, his $36,000 withdrawal is a choice. He could take less in a given year to stay under a threshold. At 73, that choice ends. The government starts requiring a minimum withdrawal from the pre-tax account, whether he needs the money or not. So the man with the biggest balance is the one who eventually loses control of the dial. His third brick stops being optional right when he might most want to turn it down. Now let me be honest about the cases where these numbers shift, because your situation is not the average. My friend Helen is a retired children's librarian. She is 69. She claimed Social Security at 62 instead of waiting. That permanently cut her check. She collects about $1,400 a month instead of the $2,000 her full benefit would have been. Her floor is lower than our examples. That means her bricks have to carry more of her life, and she crosses into the taxable zone with a smaller portfolio than he does. If you claimed early, run your own numbers, because the average does not describe you. Now the opposite case. My neighbors Ray and Carol are retiring at 65 with a combined Social Security check of about $3,600 a month. The married couple gets two checks in higher thresholds. Theirs are $32,000 and $44,000 instead of $25,000 and $34,000. Their deduction is bigger too. Run the same three portfolios for them and the picture changes completely. With $300,000, they owe no federal tax. With $600,000, they still owe nothing. Even at $900,000, their federal bill is about $606. Sit with that comparison for a second. Same $900,000. The single retiree pays $3,193. Ray and Carol pay $66. Their bricks stay nearly full the whole way up. His shrink with every one he adds. So being single in retirement is expensive in a way nobody warns you about. It is also why the surviving spouse often gets hit hardest. One check stops, the thresholds get cut, and the withdrawals stay exactly the same size. There's a fourth thing that changes everything. And I have to mention it because it is the single biggest lever on this entire calculation. Where the money sits. Every number I just gave you assumed a traditional pre-tax account. Roth money behaves completely differently. Roth withdrawals do not count in your provisional income at all. They do not drag your Social Security onto the tax return. They do not push you into a higher bracket, so $900,000 in a Roth pays dramatically more per month than $900,000 in a 401k. Same balance on the statement, different amount of usable money for the rest of your life. Think about what that means for our third man. His problem was never the size of his account. His problem was that every withdrawal announced itself to the IRS and pulled his Social Security along with it. Roth dollars walk out quietly. Same $3,000 a month, no torpedo. If you are still working and have any room to steer future contributions, that is the lever that matters most. I did a whole video on it, and if you already have both kinds of accounts, the order you pull from is a real lever. Say our second man needs $24,000 a year, he pulls $18,000 from the 401k and the last $6,000 from a Roth. His provisional income drops to $3,500, that is back under the upper threshold. So far less of his Social Security gets taxed. Same $24,000 in his pocket, smaller bill. That is why having money in two different buckets is worth so much in retirement. It is not about which account is better. It is about having a dial you can turn in, a year when turning it matters. All of this changes one very practical question. Is the next $100,000 worth saving? Run it! If you are sitting at $300,000 and you add another $100,000, that money pays you $333.23 a month, and you keep every cent of it. If you are sitting at $900,000 and you add the same $100,000, it pays you $259. Same $100,000, $74 a month apart, for life, depending only on where you already were when you added it. So here is where all of this lands. Every 300,000 you add pays less than the last one. It gets taxed harder and carries more market risk. So chasing the next 300,000 is not automatically your best move. There is another way to close the same gap. Cut $1,000 a month out of your spending. You have just done the same thing as adding a $300,000 brick. Your portfolio has to cover $1,000 less. The relief is identical, except this version arrives with no tax. It does not raise your provisional income. Your Social Security never gets dragged onto the taxable line, and it does not depend on the market cooperating for 30 years. Brick 3 showed up with a 21% haircut. This one shows up whole. And you can build that brick with things that are not sacrifices. A paid-off house is a brick. Moving from 2 cars to 1 is most of a brick. Dropping a health plan you no longer need at 65 is part of 1. None of those show up on a brokerage statement. All of them lower the number your portfolio has to carry, permanently, tax-free. That is why 2 people with the same $600,000 can be living completely different retirements. One of them is trying to fund a life that costs $6,000 a month. The other paid off the house and shaped a life that costs $3,800. The second person is not richer, she just needed fewer bricks. Now, the honest limits, because I owe you these. The 4% rule assumes a retirement of about 30 years. Retire at 55 instead of 67, and you should shade that down toward 3.5%. Here is what that costs. At 3.5%, 300,000 pays $875 a month instead of $1,000. The 600,000 pays $1,750. The 900,000 pays $2,625. Lower, but far more likely to still be there when you are 90. That is the trade, and it is worth making if your retirement is long. I used federal tax only. Most states do not tax Social Security, but some tax retirement withdrawals, and that changes your net. The senior bonus deduction that helped our first man so much is temporary. It runs through 2028 as written. If it goes away, that clean first brick gets less clean. And the $2,083 average is an average. Your check depends on your earnings history and the age you claimed. Go to ssa.gov and pull your real number rather than using mine. There is a practical cost to all of this that goes beyond the tax bill itself. Almost every retirement calculator you have ever used works in gross dollars. You put in your balance, it hands you a monthly number, and you build your whole plan on it. Our third man planned around $5,083 a month. He actually gets $4,817. That is $266 a month he budgeted for and never receives. Over a 25-year retirement, that gap is roughly $80,000 of spending he thought he had. He did not overspend a dollar. He simply planned his whole retirement with the wrong number. So what do you actually do with this? Stop asking what your portfolio is worth and start asking what it nets you. Those are different questions. Only one of them buys groceries. Take your expected Social Security. Then add 4% of your savings. Then run your provisional income. That is your withdrawal plus half your Social Security. See which side of 25,000 and 34,000 you land on. That one calculation tells you whether your next dollar of savings comes to you whole or comes to you with a bite taken out. And then ask the question almost nobody asks, not how do I get to 900,000? Instead, how few dollars can I make my portfolio responsible for? Because the man with 900,000 and a $6,000 lifestyle is stretched thin. He looks wealthy on paper and feels tight every month. The woman with 400,000 and a paid-off house sleeps fine. The number on the statement was never the thing that decided it. Tell me in the comments which side of the threshold you land on, and whether you had ever heard of provisional income before today. I read every comment and I reply to as many as I can. And if you want the next video, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.